So this lecture is going to cover the time period that we refer to as Reconstruction, which was after the Civil War. Just a recap, the Civil War was fought in the United States from 1861 to 1865 between the northern part of the country, the Union, but against 11 states that had seceded or left the Union and formed their own country. They were the Confederate States of America, often referred to as the Confederacy. They thought of themselves as their own country, and in fact, during this time, the United States, as we know, ceased to exist. We were two separate countries fighting one another. Ultimately, the North, or the Union, wins the war, and we have to figure out how to put our country back together. And so that is this time period we're going to talk about with this lecture. So this time period after the war, as I mentioned, is called Reconstruction. It was during this time that politicians began to plan on how to rebuild or reconstruct the country. They had to figure out how to let the southern states back into the Union or back into the United States because they had left. They had formed their own nation. So now we have to figure out how to get them back. There were two key questions that really needed to be answered or dealt with at the time. The first question is, what conditions should be placed on the southern states? In order for them to rejoin the Union, what should they have to do? And then finally, the second question was, how do you handle bad feelings between the states? The Northerners really felt like the Southerners should be punished. The Southerners, on the other hand, were angry at the Northerners for telling them what to do and having this strong central government that continued to try to rule over them in a way that they felt was not beneficial for the Southern states. These plans actually began to come about before the war actually ended in 1865. When it became clear that the North was winning the war in 1864, that's when we start to see some of these plans develop. There were a number of different plans. The first was Lincoln's plan, often called the 10% plan. He has a quote that said, "With malice toward none and charity for all." So there was no evil, right? He wasn't trying to get back at anybody, but really wanted to just unite the country as quickly as possible. He believed that the North should pardon or forgive Southerners who took an oath of loyalty to the Union and who agreed to abide or to follow the new laws which outlawed slavery. He argued that once 10% of eligible voters took that oath or pledged allegiance to the Union and agreed, again, to abolish slavery, that states could establish a new state government, and that state government could then apply to be back in the Union. Many Northerners felt that this was too lenient or too easy. Many Northerners really wanted punishment for what they thought were the rebels or the Southerners. Johnson had a different plan. So Johnson was President Lincoln's vice president. So when Lincoln becomes assassinated, or when Lincoln was assassinated, President Johnson took his place. And he was actually he believed in being even easier on Southerners. He believed that they should pardon or forgive nearly all the Southerners except for Confederate leaders and wealthy landowners. So anybody who was a leader of the Southern Rebellion, if you will, or the Southern Confederacy, he believed they should not be pardoned. And he believed the wealthy landowners, those huge plantation owners, should not be pardoned, but everybody else should. Again, if you can imagine, people thought Lincoln's plan was too lenient. A lot of people really didn't like Johnson's plan. The other group were kind of these radical Republicans. Now these, both Lincoln and Johnson were Republicans, but they were much more moderate. The radical Republicans were the really extreme Republicans. These were politicians from the North who really wanted to punish the South. Some, like Thaddeus Stevens, even wanted true equality for African Americans. They felt that Lincoln and Johnson were both too lenient, and the radical Republicans refused to even allow Southern Democrats into Congress, which means that these Southern Democrats had no political power, right? If they weren't even allowed in, they had no voice. One of the things that they actually proposed is what was called the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis bill said that the majority of voters, so 51% of voters in the area, had to take a loyalty oath. They had to agree to treat freed slaves equally, Instead of just saying, hey, you got to abolish slavery, they actually added that you had to treat them equally. The big problem with the Wade-Davis bill was there was no way to enforce this. How do you enforce whether or not freed slaves are now treated equally? It does not ever actually become an act, but this is just evidence of kind of what the radical Republicans really wanted. So you see these different plans. Ultimately, what did pass were the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 1868. These acts, or these laws, created 5 military districts in the South. Military commanders who were from the North, they went there and they assisted in writing new state constitutions for all the southern states. Each state had to agree to ratification of the 14th Amendment. Ratification means acceptance, right? And this really becomes kind of the basis of all civil rights claims in the future, the 14th Amendment. And we'll talk more about it a little bit later in the lecture. The other thing that the radical Republicans also managed to accomplish is to pass the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is what allows for African American men for the right to vote. So this allows all men the right to vote. And the final act that the radical Republicans were able to pass during this time period was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This law barred discrimination, or outlawed, right? It bars discrimination in hotels, theaters, and railroads. The problem with this is that it was rarely enforced. There really was nobody there to make sure that these laws were being followed. And if nobody's there checking in to make sure the laws are being followed, and if they're not being enforced, then they really don't exist, right? No one's going to follow it if the law is not being enforced. Another thing that happens during this time period are these laws that get passed, or amendments to the Constitution. So we have what are called the Civil Rights Amendments. There's 3 of them. The first one is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is the amendment to the Constitution that actually outlaws slavery. So this is what ends slavery. It's not the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln writes during the Civil War, but it's actually the 13th Amendment. This actually changes the Constitution. The 14th Amendment said that all people born in the United States are now citizens, okay? So it made all people born in the U.S., they are now citizens. What this means is that those freed slaves who were born here are now citizens. So the 14th Amendment doesn't just give freed slaves their citizenship. It says that anybody born in the United States is now a citizen. However, the impact of this means that freed slaves are now citizens. The other piece is that it guarantees all citizens equal rights under the law. This is called the Equal Protection Clause, and this means that the law has to treat everybody the same. And when I mentioned above about this really being kind of the basis of all civil rights claims in the future, it's that Equal Protection Clause that gets used, right? It's this equal protection saying that it guarantees, the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law for all citizens. And again, it identifies a citizen as somebody born in the United States or in the jurisdiction thereof. That just means any territory, okay? And then finally, the other one that's passed is the 15th Amendment. I mentioned it above. The 15th Amendment is universal male suffrage. And suffrage is a key word that is S-U-F-F-R-A-G-E, suffrage, and that means the right to vote. So universal male suffrage means that all men now have the right to vote. Again, so the 15th Amendment extends voting rights to African American men, as long as they have they have to follow the same qualifications, though, as white men as well. So they have to be property owning, they could have fought in the Union, and they have to be literate. They have to be able to read and write. So those are all the qualifications that all men had to follow in order to vote. Life in the South after the war did not just turn around and all of a sudden become wonderful. There was some serious destruction that had happened in the South. One of the things that had happened was the scorched earth policy during Sherman's march to the sea. He took his troops and he literally burned everything behind him. He disrupted industry and economy by completely scorching the land. The South lost 9,000 miles of railroad track, and that's just with one campaign. 20% of the voting age males died during this time period. So not only have you destroyed a ton of land, but you've also lost 20% of your young kind of working men. Not only that, but the labor force that these Southerners had known forever was now gone, right? With the end of slavery, they don't have the laborers that they're used to having, especially the free labor, right? They had to pay for housing and they had to pay, keep them clothed and fed and housed, but they didn't have to pay them to work. And now all of a sudden, that labor force has gone since slavery has ended. Another issue you had in the South were all these freed slaves, right? So again, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. You now have about 4 million people who are poor and uneducated roaming around. And this is a major issue that comes about during Reconstruction. Some of the benefits during this time is that these freed slaves did, for often the first time in their life, receive some basic freedoms. They were allowed to own property, for example. Their marriages were finally recognized as legal. Their marriages had never been recognized by the state before. Most freed slaves sought to connect with their families and begin to build homes and just reestablish their life kind of away from bondage and away from that institution of slavery. While many of them did experience these basic freedoms, there were also a number of restrictions placed upon them. During Reconstruction, we see a code of laws called the Black Codes. These were state laws that were designed to keep Black people or African Americans in poverty, or kind of a form of slavery. One of the ways they did this is they said that African Americans or freed slaves could not own weapons. So you can imagine many of the slave owners, the previous slave owners, were afraid of rebellion. They did not want African Americans to be able to get their hands on weapons and kind of rise up. So that's one way that we see African American rights restricted even after the war is over and during this time of Reconstruction. They couldn't testify against whites or serve on juries. So again, this means that they really have no power in society. If a crime is committed against them by a white person, they could not actually confront that person in the court of law because they were not legally allowed to testify against white people. And if you're an African American and you go on trial for something, you're never going to actually have a jury of your peers because African Americans were not allowed to serve on juries. So you're going to be held accountable by a jury of all white people. The other piece was that if you couldn't prove that you were working, so if it looked like you were unemployed, you couldn't prove that you had a job, then white landowners could hire you. And you had no choice if you weren't working. And so again, we see these laws as kind of a way to take away rights from African Americans during a time period where they actually saw some of their basic freedoms being instituted, often for the first time. One of the things that we do see, as I mentioned, was we talked about the 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote, but we also see those rights restricted. So using intimidation, Southerners were not breaking any federal laws by intimidating African Americans, but this was definitely part of getting African Americans to not vote. Now, it's important you understand that many African Americans did vote during Reconstruction. African Americans were, in fact, voted into political offices for the first time during this time period of Reconstruction, but it wasn't like all African Americans began voting during this time because there was a lot of intimidation. There was also limitation by state laws. I mentioned literacy, right? You had to prove that you could read or write. So literacy tests had to be taken. This becomes a serious problem for African Americans for a number of reasons. Number one, it was usually a white person administering the test or giving the test, and the test was graded by whoever administered it. Also, most African American voters were, in fact, illiterate. Most of them could not read and write because most of them, particularly in the South, had been slaves. slaves were often forbidden. It was outlawed to learn how to read and write. And so most of these people who now are trying to vote simply cannot read and write, so they cannot pass these literacy tests, which was a way that Southern states kept African Americans out of the polling booths even after the men had the right to vote. Another way was through a poll tax. The poll tax had to be paid when the voter arrived at the poll, which is where you go to vote. African Americans had no extra money during this time. Again, most of them in the South had just come out of slavery where they were not paid while they were slaves, so they don't have money just lying around that they can use to pay this poll tax. And then finally, there was a grandfather clause. Now, it's important you understand, what this clause said is that if your grandfather voted in 1867, then you can vote. What this does is it is another way to keep African Americans away from voting, right? Because African Americans could not vote in 1867. Also, it's a way to actually recapture the white votes. Many poor white people were also illiterate, right? They couldn't read or write, so they couldn't pass literacy tests. Also, many white people in the South were actually poor, so they also could not pay the poll tax. However, their grandfathers were able to vote in 1867. And so this is a way to allow white people in the South to be able to vote, even if they can't pass a literacy test or a poll tax. And it's another way to keep out the African American vote because their grandfathers were not able to vote during the time period that this clause uses. Now, when we look back at this time period, we do need to do kind of an assessment of Reconstruction. There were definitely some successes and some failures. One of the key successes during this time period was an institution that's called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was designed to help freed slaves and poor whites in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food and housing and medical aid. They set up schools. They offered legal assistance, especially with reuniting families. They encouraged plantation owners to rebuild and replant and to hire poor whites and freed slaves as their laborers. The Southern economy also began to rebuild during this time. As I mentioned, with the aid from the Freedmen's Bureau, many plantation owners did in fact replant. There was some industry being rebuilt and railroads were being rebuilt during this time period after the Civil War. And then, of course, there's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? And abolishing slavery. We can't look at this time period and not acknowledge that that was a huge success of this time. Again, the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to freed slaves, and then allowing African American men the right to vote. And then one of the final pieces that happens during this time period was the establishment of public schools for African Americans. So encouraging African Americans to get that education that for so many generations they'd missed out on. This was a key piece of a key piece of Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War. On the other hand, there were definitely some failures as well. During this time, we still see extreme poverty in the South. While some industry or businesses were rebuilt, the South overall was very slow to industrialize. Informal slavery really did continue. It was often called tenant farming or sharecropping. What this looked like is that a landowner would provide housing and tools and seeds to a worker, and the worker got to keep a portion of the crop and could sell it at the market themselves. However, they never actually made enough money to leave. They never made enough money to pay off the debt that they owed to the landowner for using this land, so now they become economically tied to the land and they can't actually leave. So again, we see this kind of informal slavery established through tenant farming or sharecropping. Another thing we see is extreme racism in the South. Again, just because slavery is abolished doesn't change the mindset. Martin Luther King talks about that a lot 100 years later. He says, look, we can change the laws, but that's not going to change people's minds. So we see the creation of the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK during this time. They're really seen as saviors. They were claiming they want to preserve the Southern way of life. Again, the Southerners really felt like the Northerners were trying to change their way of life, trying to rebuild their society. They didn't feel like their society needed to be rebuilt. And so the KKK were often seen as the saviors of the Southern way of life. And then the final piece that represents ultimately the failure of Reconstruction was Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a law that actually passes about 20 years after Reconstruction ends. Some background, it's a court case. Some background is you have a man named Homer Plessy, who's 1/8 African American, and he sat in a white-only train car on a Louisiana train. He did this in order to challenge the Separate Car Act of Louisiana. This law required separate cars for blacks and whites on the railroad. Plessy claimed that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. He said that it doesn't treat everybody the same by splitting people up. The court heard the case, and ultimately they decided against Plessy. And this is the key that you need to understand about Plessy versus Ferguson. The court said that separate but equal is constitutional. This means that they have now legalized segregation at the highest level in U.S. government. As long as there are facilities for blacks and whites, it was okay to separate the races. The outcome of this becomes really a firm institutionalization of the Jim Crow laws, those black codes we talked about. Those Jim Crow laws are now legalized and enforced. They've legalized and enforced segregation throughout the South, and they can because of this court case. This becomes the rule for the next 60 years here in the United States. Many historians, in fact, point to this as the evidence of failure of Reconstruction. This becomes a turning point that really establishes segregation throughout our country. Ultimately, Reconstruction ends in 1876. Hayes gets elected as president, and part of that means part of the reason why he gets elected is he agreed to remove the troops from the South. Remember those military districts we talked about. The troops leave the South, and no one is left to enforce the Civil War amendments anymore. Jim Crow rules once the troops leave, and nearly all those African American elected officials were replaced by whites within just a few years. And then, as I mentioned again, after this, you also have Plessy versus Ferguson, really cementing kind of this understanding and the failure of Reconstruction, that the goals of uniting the country perhaps happened, but not in the way that many historians were hoping would or could happen after the Civil War. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to write your summary.